From limo diplomacy to a ceremonial guard, Vladimir Putin got a red carpet welcome in India this week. He was there to talk trade ties and energy supply with Narendra Modi. But as New Delhi tries to walk a tightrope between Moscow and Washington, what's at stake and who stands to benefit the most? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Narendra Modi rolled out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin on Friday, welcoming the Russian president with a guard of honour and a volley of cannon fire, likely heard all the way in Washington. The visit was lavish and friendly, with both leaders calling their relationship special, privileged and resilient to external pressures. Now, that's a direct dig at US President Donald Trump after he imposed punitive sanctions on India to discourage its purchase of large volumes of Russian oil. Those have been a major boon for Russia's struggling sanctioned economy. Trade ties were the focus of the meeting between Putin and Modi. So what exactly was signed in New Delhi? How is this meeting being viewed in both countries? And what will it mean for the future of two of the world's largest economies? We'll put those questions to our guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Imogen Kimber.
President Vladimir Putin is on his first trip to India since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, despite Western pressure on New Delhi to scale back its relations with Moscow over the war. India is the world's biggest buyer of Russian arms and a major importer of its seaborne oil. Putin says his country's supply of energy to India, including coal and gas, will remain uninterrupted, but he wants their relations to expand.
The Russian delegation arrived not just to discuss the energy issues, place orders and sign contracts for delivery of oil and gas. We want to develop multifaceted relations with India along various tracks. India has huge and growing potential in many areas.
The two leaders officially say they'll grow their joint trade to $100 billion by 2030. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says energy security has long been a pillar of relations between the two nations, and that they'll hit their trade target sooner than expected.
I
don't think we'll have to wait until 2030. We are committed to moving forward on the Northern Sea route, the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor. Progress will be made in this direction soon. This will reduce transit times, lower costs, and open up new markets for businesses.
India is not violating any agreements or international law by buying oil from Russia. But while Western countries imposed sanctions and reduced their energy consumption from Russia, India ramped up its own at discounted prices, before cutting back after it was hit by punitive tariffs by the US. Washington and New Delhi are currently in talks to create a new deal and reduce those levies. But both Putin and Modi say any kind of what they call punishment is hypocritical.
The US itself still buys nuclear fuel from us for its own nuclear power plants. That's also fuel, uranium for the reactors operating in the United States. If the US has the right to buy our fuel, why shouldn't India have the same privilege?
The EU is also continuing some trade with Russia, including importing gas. The two leaders are using their meeting to send a clear message to the world that India and Russia's relations won't bow to external pressure, with Modi referring to Putin as his friend on X and describing the relationship between the two countries as time-tested. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's take a quick look at India and Russia's economic ties. Historically, trade was largely made up of Russian military exports to India and only about $10 billion a year. Now, that was before the invasion of Ukraine. In 2022, with India refusing to join the sanctions regime against Moscow, trade boomed. It's now worth over $68 billion, a record high, with the jump mainly as a result of India buying oil at discounted prices. New Delhi is now Moscow's second largest trading partner after China by a large margin. Let's bring in our guests. From New Delhi, we're joined by Brahma Chellaney, Professor of Strategic Studies at the Center for Policy Research. From Boston, Virginia, we're joined by Thomas Pickering, former diplomat and US ambassador to India and Russia. And also in New Delhi is Aleksei Zakharov, a fellow at Observer Research Foundation who focuses on Russian foreign policy towards South Asia and its relations with India. A warm welcome to you all. Brahma, Chellaney, Professor, let's start with you. To what extent does India's hosting of President Putin, and so lavishly, signal India's rejection to the West of the us or them narrative? And if it does, is that rejection risky for India or a sign of its pragmatism?
India's strategic priorities called for constructive relations with both the US and Russia. India needs both the US and Russia to counter China's aggressive rise. The central diplomatic challenge for New Delhi is to maintain a careful equilibrium between Washington and Moscow, thereby safeguarding the independence of India's foreign policy. US policies in recent years, as you know, have helped push Russia closer to China. As a result, India has an even stronger incentive to keep its relationship with Moscow steady and substantial. In other words, the need for India to preserve a resilient partnership with Moscow has only grown more pressing. But what stands out is that India's steady, time-tested partnership with Russia today stands in stark contrast to Washington's increasingly erratic and punitive approach toward New Delhi. Trump, for example, has slapped tariffs on India that exceed those on China. And that's quite an irony, because the US-India partnership was built on a mutual interest in countering China's aggressive rise. But today, Trump is treating India more harshly than even China. And he has singled India out for secondary sanctions over its purchases of Russian oil, while sparing other major Russian energy buyers, such as the EU, Turkey, Japan, and of course, China.
Okay.
And I think the double standard lays bare that Trump's trade coercion against India is driven less by principle than by geopolitical convenience. In fact, he is using India's oil purchases as a crude bargaining tactic to get a more favorable trade deal on the terms he has pushed for. In other words,
Professor,
he wants a trade deal.
We'll explore that in a little more depth in just a few moments. But first, I want to bring in Ambassador Pickering. Thomas, how will Washington have perceived Putin's visit to India this week? To what extent is New Delhi perhaps legitimizing Moscow's position on Ukraine by rolling out the red carpet to President Putin this week?
There's a certain amount of that and a certain amount of Indian resistance to the idea that tariff pressures and similar sanctions can somehow be a controlling element in the US-Indian relations, lining up India as an opponent of Russia over the question of Ukraine. There is, in my view, more fundamental rightness in the approach than there is in the method or the strategy. Forceful pressure against states with whom you have enjoyed a useful relationship of mutual interest is not a formula that diplomacy generally adopts as something that is going to be successful. And we see now that this particular meeting is sending all the signs of basically disdain for American pressure and influence. I think the professor was quite prescient in his raising the question of China. There are a couple of ghosts, if we could call them that, at the picnic of India and Russia. One of those is the US and President Trump. The other is China and President Xi. And we should not forget that. I have a feeling that China is being underattended to both by the US and by India, and that China could be a useful influence in settling the Ukraine-Russia war if, in fact, the diplomacy moved it in that direction. That's a different story, and I won't torture you with further comments on that particular piece, except to say it should not go unnoticed.
Thank you, Ambassador. Aleksei, how important to Russia is its relationship with India, both politically right now and, of course, economically?
Since the war in Ukraine, the significance of India for Russian foreign policy has grown significantly. India has always been a long-standing partner for Russia, but now, as we can see, Russia has rediscovered India as the largest market and an opportunity for Russian experts to be reoriented to Asian markets. And here, India is one of the major destinations. If we look at the Russian delegations during this summit, we would identify a large number of representatives from the economic bloc of the Russian government. That has never been the case, by the way. It now resembles how the Russian delegations from the government go to China. And we can see that there is a plethora of interests across different economic sectors that Russia is now pursuing. It is not only supplying energy resources in huge numbers, it has also increased its exports of agricultural products, of chemical products like fertilizers, and it's also exploring different investment projects in India in the form of joint ventures and other. So India's role has been reconsidered in Russia, and we can see that Russia is trying to economically embrace New Delhi now.
Professor Chellaney, is India willing to continue to build a relationship with Russia that is beyond limits, as Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, put it ahead of President Putin's visit to India? I mean, what does beyond limits mean? And what does India want or need from Russia that it can't get from its Western partners?
First, the Kremlin spokesperson was offering India a bait because there has been concern in India that Western policy has pushed Russia into a de facto alliance with China, and China and Russia advertise a no-limits partnership. So Moscow is suggesting that if India wants, Russia can also build a no-limits partnership with India. But that's just rhetoric. The reality is that both for Russia and for India, this relationship is very important for India. It provides better balance and greater maneuverability in foreign policy. And I think the joint statement that came out yesterday, just before Putin returned home, the statement was headlined, "A time-tested partnership anchored in trust and mutual respect." Over 75 years, this relationship has been built on trust and mutual respect. Unfortunately, trust and mutual respect are two key elements missing in the US-India relationship, especially because of the punitive approach under President Trump in his second term, which is actually quite a stark contrast to his first term approach toward India, where he actually embraced India and US-India relations thrived. India was given pride of place in Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Quad was resurrected again with India as a key player. Today, the geopolitics of the second Trump administration seems to be very different from the first Trump administration. And as far as the visit of Putin is concerned, I think the symbolism of that visit mattered even more than the deliverables. And this was, as you know, Putin's first trip to India since the Ukraine war began. And by showing up in New Delhi with a large delegation of CEOs, more than 75 CEOs accompanied him, he advertised that Russia has options beyond China, and that the US, by isolating Russia from the Western markets, has effectively pushed Putin to discover India as a valuable economic partner in order for Moscow to reduce its dependence on China.
Okay. Ambassador Pickering, I just want to pick up on something that Professor Chellaney said there about trust and mutual respect. I mean, you're a diplomat, and we hear that all the time from leaders in their post-summit press conferences. What on earth does trust and mutual respect mean? How concerned will Washington be about Dmitry Peskov's comments about wanting to build a relationship that's beyond limits? And for how long can India tread this middle path between the West and Russia? Will it come under increasing pressure to take sides, certainly as long as the war on Ukraine goes on? To what extent is India at the moment practicing a form of appeasement between the US, Russia, and Europe to avoid angering any of them?
There is no question at all that this is a multipolar contest of some sort going on today around India and its relationship with Russia, with the United States, and as Professor Chellaney has said, and I have emphasized too, with China. We need to continue to look at that, and we need to look at that in the context as well of what the Europeans are doing, who in some cases have adopted the American approach of sanctioning to try to achieve some help in the ending of the Ukraine-Russia war in a situation that does not totally beggar Ukraine. So we're in the middle of a contest that is in the middle of contests. I believe that trust, believability, honesty, and straightforwardness have very important roles to play in diplomacy, particularly in the quiet diplomacy that goes on in the offices between the two leaders of the two parties being consulted, or in multilateral arrangements between the leaders. And these are the things that build trust and confidence: saying what you mean, meaning what you say, and carrying out what you commit. President Trump has a more mercurial view of all of this. I'll let others analyze that in more detail, but that particular view is subject to what I would call variability at choice moments. And the notion that the United States is changing its view as things go on, in part in response to criticism, in part in response to inspiration that President Trump may himself believe is fundamentally important, and in part, I think, part of the real estate practice in land and building sales that makes up so much of the background of the negotiators and President Trump himself, and that unpredictability is there. I cannot count on unpredictability to cure the relationship that is in some ways now impaired by a growth in the lack of trust and the lack of consistency. One hopes that it does, but so far it does not seem to have been a successful gambit either in the Middle East or in the Balkans and Ukraine.
Alexei, what does the continued emphasis between Russia and India on defense cooperation, from aircraft upgrades to missile systems and joint production, mean for military balance in Asia, particularly concerning China, which we've mentioned often in our discussion, and, of course, Pakistan? Is Russia's defense cooperation with India stabilizing the region or adding further complexity and perhaps insecurity?
It's a traditional story. Russia has been a long-standing supplier of defense systems to India. It dates back to the Cold War era times, and Russia emerged as a supplier as early as in late 1950s. So it has always been keen to supply both ready-made equipment and also share with licenses for production of its equipment on Indian soil. Later it emerged into the technological transfer. And that's how India has become reliant on much of the Russian military platforms. I would say that for a long time it has been a way to stabilize the region, because the United States were supporting Pakistan in more often, which resulted in Syrian crisis in South Asia, and Russia was more on the Indian side. Currently, I think in the modern times, Russia has been eyeing to explore some type of the military cooperation with Pakistan, but for India it has been a red line, and that's why Moscow, understanding that Indian market is more lucrative, and there is in general more strategic understanding and geopolitical affinity with New Delhi, Russia has been quite careful to open this Pandora box. Currently, the defense cooperation is more of an obscure item. We don't know about the details of the intensive talks that have been there over the recent months. But some deals can be on the agenda. India is interested in procuring Russian air defense systems. They have proven to be efficient during the recent Operation Sindoor in May 2025. So I think that there may be some deals that are now in the stage of work in progress and need more negotiations and coordination on technical modalities, maybe on procurement details, but they may be upcoming next year.
Professor Chellaney, how does India respond to the accusation that by continuing to buy Russian oil, it is funding Russia's war machine? What impact have US tariffs had on India's economy? Can India afford to keep buying Russian oil?
There is some context to this that one has to keep in mind, that in 2019, when Trump was serving his first term, he imposed sanctions on Iran, prohibiting its exports of oil. Iran is next door to India and traditionally had been India's leading supplier of oil, providing important discounts to India. India immediately complied fully with US sanctions on Iran. But China seized the opportunity, began buying enormous quantities of Iranian oil at steep discounts. In other words, the US sanctions, the main brunt was borne by India. Indirectly, the US aided China's accumulation of additional economic power. China ended up expanding its security footprint in Iran. So when the dynamic unfolded after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India did not want to repeat the same story of being a loser. But even more interesting is the fact that if you look at what others have contributed to Russia's coffers in the same period since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU, by its own figures, has contributed $311 billion until March this year to Russia's coffers by buying Russian energy. But India's oil imports from Russia certainly do not come anywhere close to $311 billion. So there is a kind of a false impression of India sustaining Russia's war machine.
Professor?
The fact is that there are other important importers of Russian energy, including Japan and Turkey, and of course the biggest importer being China.
Professor, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We're rapidly running out of time. Ambassador Pickering, India-Russia ties are obviously still as strong as they were when you were ambassador to both nations. Does President Putin's visit to India this week reinforce perhaps skepticism in the US about India as a reliable partner, or is perhaps there an understanding of New Delhi's constraints in the corridors of power in Washington?
American domestic politics are deeply divided. For some, it will be seen as betrayal of a relationship which President Trump attempted to build in his first administration, as we have seen, and has in many ways over the years, the United States sought through arms supply, through training arrangements, through joint cooperation, through the Quad, through other activities to build a relationship with India, which covered both security, politics, and economics. That does not seem at the moment to be prospering and provide a benefit. The India-Russia relationship has shifted, particularly in economic terms. It's now on cash for commodities on each side. oil for military equipment, principally. In the past, it was barter, food, rice, things of that sort for military equipment. So it is on a more sustainable basis, if I can say that, and a basis on which India is not prepared to bend its politics under economic pressure, obviously fearing that once you begin going down that street, you lose a good bit of your sovereignty and independence, particularly if you don't agree with the objectives.
Again,
I don't believe in New Delhi can feel that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is irrelevant.
Ambassador, I'm sorry again to interrupt. We've got less than 2 minutes left, and I want to hear one more time from Aleksei. Where do you see this obviously strong relationship going? Can it stay as strong in the face of pressure from the US and Europe? What does it mean for the wider region, particularly China?
Well, the Russian hope is that actually India-Russia relationship the successes in India-Russia relationship can turn into a successful cooperation in triangle. Russia, as part of its Greater Eurasia initiative, is pushing for a trilateral partnership between Russia, India, and China. We have seen some optics in this regard emanating from the recent SCO summit in Tianjin. Probably both leaders, both President Putin and Narendra Modi, felt that the moment is right to have this photo opportunity as a triangle. But at the same time, we haven't seen over the past 4 years Troika being somewhat operational at any levels. There are some talks at the track 2 level on how to look at Eurasia from different perspectives. But at the same time, I think that India is now making more emphasis on bilateral relationship with Russia and China separately. Though from the Moscow point of view, as I mentioned, it is an idea of a Eurasian trio being responsible for different security matters and being on the same page on how to approach and resolve conflicts sounds good.
All right, many thanks indeed. We must end our discussion. We're out of time for today. Brahma, Chellaney, Thomas Pickering, Aleksei Zakharov, many thanks indeed for being with us today. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time. That's at the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.